So thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to the Circle CI Custom Base Docker Image webinar. I'm your host, Ryan Pedersen. I am a solutions engineer here at Circle CI. All right, to set an agenda, here's what we have prepared. First, we'll cover off on exactly what a base image is, how it fits into the process here at Circle CI. Touch on some Docker and Dockerfile basics and things to keep in mind when building your base image. And we'll follow up with a quick demo, build one live, integrate into continuous integration, and finish off by talking about storing and maintaining your base image. Again, Q&A should be at the bottom of the Zoom chat, so feel free to drop questions there as they come up, and then we'll get to them at the end, or feel free to, I can shoot you over any information after. Okay, first question and a good primer. What is a base image? All right, to set the stage, just wanted to clarify some of our terms that we use at Circle CI. What we're looking at here is a workflow, which is a collection of jobs specifying which jobs run and in which order. Each box that we see here is its own job, which means its own independent ephemeral environment spun up on the fly to your specifications, torn down after. And a job consists of an executor, which is the environment made from a base image with Docker, and then a collection of steps and commands to be run in the environment. As far as picking an executor, we have 4 for you to choose from, depending on your needs. Docker, Mac OS, Windows, and VM. You can use whichever environment you need for each job, but we see the majority of builds making use of Docker, and that's where this webinar will be focused. All right, there are 2 ways to think about Docker and Circle CI. The first, which will be the focus of the webinar, is the execution environment. It's defined at the top of the job, and it's the image that is the base for all the commands for that particular job. The other is running Docker commands as part of the job, doing things like attaching a Docker environment to build and publish Docker images. We won't be covering that in detail, but we certainly will touch on it in regards to actually building and maintaining the Docker base image. All right. Circle CI maintains a fleet of Docker images, which we call convenience images, for various programming languages, a few databases, and they're specifically designed to run well in a CI environment. We'll go into what that entails in a bit. And they exist to serve as a quick and convenient starting point for users. They're all under our Circle CI public repository if you want to take a look under the hood, and we'll touch on that also in a bit. In Docker terminology, what this means is the images are generally optimized to have fewer, smaller layers, leads to faster image downloads when a build starts, and also a higher likelihood that the image is already cached on the host, because we cache our base images across the host. And in order to have consistent deterministic builds, the images are also updated on a predefined schedule. So for you, just leads to more stable images you can depend on. All right, so building your own. All right, before we get started going down this path, I want everyone to stop and think, is this the right course of action? Just because you can make your own base image doesn't always mean that you should. A lot of developers who don't want to install a few packages at runtime because it'll increase their build time by 30 seconds, and they invest hours into creating their own image and then more time over the months and years to maintain the image. Sometimes just not worth it. Sometimes, of course, it is. When weighing the pros and cons, this is a good list to start with. First thing you might notice is that speed comes up under both columns. Reason behind this is that speed depends on a few factors. With Circle CI images, they're cached across our host, as I mentioned. So if you're using one, there's a high likelihood that it will already be cached there. Additionally, we optimize our images to have fewer and smaller layers, meaning these images will lead to faster image downloads when a build starts. We also handle the burden of updating the images. We have monthly updates on the 2nd of each month, so you know it's going to be consistent across that. For custom images, the speed gains come in a few different ways. The Goldilocks zone for situations where we'd recommend customizing images, be installing lots of packages, Source code needs to be compiled, or downloads occur over slow connections. That's where your own custom Docker image will shine, that sweet spot, and that's what we'll cover off on during the demo in the course of the webinar. All right, so before we make our own, let's cover off on the basics of Docker images, how to go about optimizing them, and a lot of these best practices really apply to making our own base image. All right, first off, Docker has great documentation. They go into detail on the best practices, writing Docker files. Before we make our own for CI, we'll go into some general Docker information that applies. Docker image is a read-only template, contains a set of instructions for creating a container that can run on the Docker platform. Builds images automatically, reads the instructions from a Docker file, which is a text file, contains all the commands in order needed to build the image. And Docker file adheres to a specific format and set of instructions. To tie that all together, put a bow, Docker image consists of read-only layers, each of which represents a Docker file instruction. Layers are stacked. Each one is a delta of changes from the previous layer. The image defined by your Docker file should generate containers that are as ephemeral as possible. When we say ephemeral, we mean that containers can be stopped and destroyed, rebuilt and replaced with minimum setup and configuration. Pairs really well with Circle CI because each of our jobs are also ephemeral and deterministic in nature. And each container should only have one concern. A good way to implement this in practice is not to install unnecessary packages. Just focus on setting up the base needed to perform all the necessary CI/CD tasks related to the projects. If something's a nice to have, maybe skip it. If the package's job is to put the roof on a Model T, then focus on putting the roof on the Model T. So when you issue a Docker build command, current working directory is the build context. And by default, Docker files assume to be located here, but you can specify a different location with the file flag. And regardless of where the Docker file actually lives, all recursive contents of the files and the directories in the current directory are sent to Docker as the build context. And you can also build a Docker file from standard input without build context, just piping the Docker file in. Really useful for one-off builds without writing the Docker file to the disk, or when you want to generate a Docker file but don't need it to persist after. Another good note, and one of the last ones, is multi-stage builds are integral when building images. Because an image is built during the final stage of the build process, you can minimize the image layers by leveraging the build cache. So if your build contains several layers, you can order them starting with less frequently changed. When building an image, Docker steps through the instructions in your Docker file, executes each in the order specified. So as each instruction comes up, Docker looks to see if it matches the cache and can be reused. And once there's a difference, the subsequent builds happen from scratch. So helpful to have steps that are the same at the top, and you can utilize the cache to its maximum potential there. Okay. And last thing, before we make our own, just to go through quickly the example from the Docker file docs. Again, their documentation is great, a lot of good best practices. And I'll call out a few of the common and relevant commands that we see being useful for optimizing images for CI. All right. Docker file typically starts with a from statement that declares the base image. Your new image will be used for subsequent instructions. Working directory sets the working directory for many instructions that follow it in the Docker file. If that working directory doesn't exist, it will be created even if it's not used in any subsequent Docker file instruction. Copy instruction copies new files or directories from the source, adds them to the file system, the container, the path specified. And then run, like all the other commands, very fittingly named, runs the command inside your image file system. All right, and that gets us started on making our own image. Okay, if you're going to create your own custom Docker image for continuous integration, if you're in that Goldilocks zone, we strongly recommend at minimum using our base convenience image as the starting point. Certainly is a difference between a Docker image in production to run your app versus a Docker image in CI to run your continuous integration processes. For CI, we're adding a lot of relevant tools needed for building and testing in particular. For instance, you might see that we use an Ubuntu environment. You might also know that something like Alpine is certainly smaller. We do this because there are additional tools and dependencies needed for some of the CI actions that we just don't get with that we get with Ubuntu and we don't get with Alpine. Things like libc. And if you've ever dealt with like platform problems with Alpine, this sort of setting, a lot of times it's due to this. We've been burned enough times like using Alpine with problems around like Python, networking, seg faults, you name it. Now we use Ubuntu as a best practice. And as far as like the speed, for you, there's additional good news. Any speed advantage from Alpine would likely be negated because again, our convenience images are cached across our hosts, meaning spin-up times are just as fast for this base image. And there are a few options when picking out which version of our base image to use. The edge image tag points to the latest version of the base image. It's built from the head of the master branch. Intended to be used as a testing version of the image, most recent changes, not recommended for production software. Stable image points to the latest production-ready base image. Should be used by projects that want a decent level of stability, but like to get the occasional software updates. It's updated once a month on the 2nd. And the monthly snapshot image tag is a snapshot of the image referred to by the 4-digit year dot and a 2-digit month, intended for projects that are highly sensitive to changes and want the most deterministic build possible. All right. So I want to touch on here. So you can go to our Circle CI public repository and actually look at all the base images, get a sense of what's going on under the hood. CIMG are all our next generation base images, the ones that are very stable, deterministic, fast. READMEs are all self-documenting, and the images are updated monthly, so you know everything's up to date. So if I want to look here, CIMG base, I can actually go in. If I'm going to build my own and not use this, I can take a look and understand exactly which packages, what's included in the Circle CI base image. We include the lightweight tools frequently needed in CI/CD, and we recommend using this as a starting point, even if you're not going to use our base image. More importantly, or if you just want to use, understand what you can run out of the box. So all these are pretty important. The same thing for our other images, our language ones. Go back here and I'm looking at a Rust image. Go in, take a peek. See that we're using our CIMG base, and then understand what's going on top of that. So if you have more dependencies to add, you can still include these, see what's a good practice out of the box, and then be able to use that and optimize your images for different languages. So again, we have quite a few here. One last thing to call out for the base actually is we do set our user to Circle CI. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to sudo commands. Just you're not the root user, you're under Circle CI. All right, now building our own. So I'm going to hope for the best and build one here as we go through this. All right, so the first piece of the image, and I'll talk about what we're doing as we do it, just to make sure I highlight the right pieces and the best practices here. So the first piece of the example is the from statement. Set this up using our base convenience image we talked about. We use the stable tag. It has the right combination of updates and determinism for the project as well. Okay, and the next would be run command. Also a few best practices we can learn from. As we just talked about, first one's sudo. When an image does not run as a root user, we want to make sure we prefix commands with sudo so we don't run into permissions errors. For scripting scenarios like this, we always use apt-get over apt. The apt manual actually states as designed as an end user tool, may change behavior between versions and also doesn't guarantee backward compatibility. So for us, it means apt-get is best suited for environments where humans aren't around like this. Apt is great for when you're working away on your local machine. Get update. And then, let's see, when installing with a package manager, flags like the Y are great, just to assume yes when the package manager might have tried to ask a question. Great, so that spelled install correctly, that's fantastic. And one best practice that won't make a technical difference, but will save you headaches down the road, it's just a single package per line alphabetically, which is much easier to read the source code. And when viewing PR diffs, it makes it much more clear what changed. Also add a space before the backslash. Let's see, utils. Let's see, and then string these commands together. And this would be a good place for any other packages you need. Okay. Last line here is going to delete the app cache in the image. One, it helps with caching. Yeah, let me make this bigger also. Sorry if y'all couldn't see it, I just saw that in the chat. Hope everyone gets it great. Sorry about that. All right, so remove the app cache in the image, helps with caching, and more importantly, reduces the size of the image. So cursively hit everything under this, the wildcard, great. All right, on to the last piece of the Docker file here. This is a really good base level that we get from our convenience images, but again, more packages, absolutely just add them there. But the ones that are below, definitely make sure they're the ones that change more often. Okay, so set the environmental variable here. All right, another optional thing we recommend is to set the frequently changing strings as envars, environmental variables. Makes it just visually much easier to manage. And the end instruction doesn't count as a layer in Docker. So efficiency is really increased when the value is used multiple times in the upcoming run instructions also. Go version 14.1, great. And then for this last one, I'm actually going to copy and paste it. Please excuse me. Okay. And here curl downloads a tarball, pipes it directly into the next command tar. Docker only evaluates the last exit code of the operation, the pipe, to determine success. So as long as the last exit works, you're all set. If you want the piping commands to fail due to an error at any stage in the pipe, include some kind of fail, so beforehand, and then it will fail if something does not work. So that's an optional piece also. So this piping it here just allows us to avoid saving the file to the file system. One, means it's faster, lets us avoid cleaning up the tarball afterwards. Two, in situations where you can't use a technique, make sure you clean up by deleting the tarball, zip packages, etc. with remove. Okay. Great. We recommend keeping your Docker file for a base image in its own repository. Helps keep your concerns separate and have workflows focused on keeping it up to date. And when adding or removing from your Docker file, you update it like anything else. Just create a new branch, review, merge, repeat. Excuse me doing this on master. That's probably why I'm a solution engineer, not a full engineer here. Great. So you could definitely build it, push it locally. Of course, the Circle CI webinar. So we automate the building and pushing in our Circle CI config every time we make changes locally and set up that workflow here. So under Circle CI, we have the info here. So some things to note on in our config file, you see we're using that base image, and then we're running those other Docker commands that we talked about for the building and pushing images. And then you can do it when I push to master, great, it does it. But I mentioned that we update in the second of each month. So we're trying to balance that between having to manually do it versus like doing the updates. So we have scheduled workflows that you can use. Do this by adding a triggers key to your workflow. So I have a separate one down here for a monthly update. Triggers with specifying a schedule. Under that, we include a cron key with valid cron tab entry, as well as a filters key. So what this will do is update in the third of the month if the Circle CI base image updates on the second, just to make sure things are up to date. And I'm using the stable image, so that we don't want to be updated with a very safe one. Okay. And then pulling it in. So I have another one here using it. And a few things. This is me using a base image. So this is another project that does nothing other echoes. Everything is installed. So I set the executors up here. We have one's the base image, and it manually installs the dependencies that we had. The other's the custom image that we just built, like a previous version. And another one's a custom image with authentication. So you can pull from a public or private Docker repository for your base image. And these would be the syntax to do each. A question we get a lot is just like, how do we know, or will my project, how do we know if it's going to be faster or slower? A lot of times it's the reality. It's just a good idea to test it. Make it basic, make it lean, test it, see the timing data. Something we really recommend. So this is like an example of me testing it. Spin up times for this were about the same, but it's pretty lean in the first place. So it's definitely being cached on the host is certainly helpful. All right. Maintain the image. All right. Last piece is maintaining the image. So the de facto is Docker Hub. When you're picking a Docker registry to use, say Docker registry, that just means where you host your image. There are plenty of options. If you're looking at the list and are unsure, go with Docker Hub, call it a day. It's free to use even for a private image. Otherwise, if you're using a leading cloud provider for hosting already, they likely have a Docker registry that you can use, and we likely have a Circle CI orb for that provider. Makes setup, makes everything a lot easier. All right, so that was about it for prepared. I wanted to open it up for questions. So there's a Q&A bubble at the bottom. So there's a couple here that I'll take a look at and answer, and then anything that maybe we can't get to, I'm happy to follow up afterwards. So first question was, can we get a copy of the slides, or at least the links for reference? And absolutely, I can get that to everyone afterwards. Both repositories and the config set up the relevant ones there. Another question was, what if my shell doesn't support the O pipe fail? Yeah, so not all shells support that. So let me jump into here. What you can do is use an exec form here. Should work with this pipe fail. And then it's set. Should work like that. Okay, another question. Why are the configs structured differently? That's a good question too. So the answer is, let me pull these up side by side. This is our 2.1 syntax, so it's a little more new with executors. Commands, jobs, all can be specified in workflows. by default, if you're starting anew, we recommend using that, but both are valid syntaxes, so whatever makes the most sense for you. Good question on orbs. So orbs in particular, I guess let me take a step back and clarify what orbs are for anyone having another question there. So we have a concept called orbs. Let me get our orbs directory. Orbs make it easier to set up and share across teams, and they're reusable configuration as code. So it's like a package manager for Circle CI. And we have a lot of technology partners who create orbs that do tasks in Circle CI, anything from like deploying to Kubernetes, caching a node, code coverage, and actually we have a Docker orb as well for the building and pushing. And what orbs are doing is actually simplifying this piece. So they're condensing the commands, jobs, or executors into like single lines of code, but you'd still need to specify the actual command, executor, and job that you want, and like workflows you want to do. So orbs are really just like making a convenient way to like essentially manage and share amongst teams and to simplify things. But you would still want to specify the base image that you're going to be using. Right. Yeah, and another question about the user of the Circle CI. If you're using the base image, it's created at the bottom there. So you can also just like set up a script, and I could get you an example after to test what the user is to see if it's root, and then add in sudo if it's not. But if it's set up in that base image, so if you're using that base image, it will be the Circle CI user. Sorry to repeat that question. It was when is the user Circle CI created, and kind of switch that user during a job. So that user. And again, a lot of these best practices here that we talked about. Environmental variable, the base image includes a lot of the Docker commands that are that we'll be using. So it's like the working directories, all those pieces. All right, I'll stick around for another couple minutes, see if any questions. All right, another question about, is there a way to test before pushing to Circle CI? Circle CI does have a command line interface that you can use to validate like the config, make sure the syntax for the YAML is correct. That being said, we're running once you hit your repository and send us a webhook to run to your specifications. So to run the actual build beforehand, we're using GitOps, so the Git's the source of truth there. Good question. Another question about using a custom image, if not pushing it. For example, different builds with changes from different branches from GitHub. Yeah, it's a good question. And let me take a deeper look and see, make sure I'm following. So I'll make sure I follow up with you after. All right. Question on ensuring the right number of nodes to run tests on. And that's another thing, it really comes down to experimentation. So that's alluding to test parallelization, where you can split up like unit testing over n number of nodes. So if you have like 1,000 unit tests, you can split it up to run by timing, name, or file size. And really that's just one to play around with and test. But if you're gonna play around with it, like start with 10 and try upwards, downwards, and see where that diminishing returns kicks in. All right, another question about tracking the coverage of tests within a custom image build. And the answer really is that we're an execution engine on top. So if you can track, if you could spin the image up and track the coverage in your local machine, your local Linux, Mac, or Docker environment in this case, you can do it here. So generally speaking, that's the answer. So it depends on like some of the specifics, I think, around like the coverage of tests and such, but certainly should be possible. Great. I think that's it. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to email any questions afterwards and definitely get some answers, get the links over. But hope that was informative for everybody.